Well, good afternoon. So for me, it's a real pleasure to be out. We're sitting in Oakley Court Hotel by the Thames, and when we came in this afternoon, there were people on the terrace having lunch, drinking nice glasses of Sauvignon Blanc and really enjoying themselves. We're not like that. We're in a conference room, but it's still nice to be out. And it's rigged up brilliantly, so we're sitting around the table here, and we've got a couple of colleagues, Martin Warren and Elizabeth Graves, beamed in, and it's almost like they're really here. So it's really quite fantastic, and we're in for a good afternoon today. So the process then would be Steve Toft is going to talk about his excellent report. We're then going to have some comments from some of the people who are in the room and some of them who aren't, and we'll finish on the dot at 6:30. So with that, Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. So when we first started looking at this, we thought, well, why do we think reviewing policies is important? Why do we think this is something that people should be concerned about? And really, the answer to that is that things change. Policies tend to be something that people put away in a cupboard, don't think about very much, and then before you know where things are, things have changed, attitudes change, the nature of the workforce changes. The other thing that's happened really over the last decade or so, and really has gathered pace in the last couple of years, is that expectations of companies change. So we looked at that and thought, well, yeah, this is a good thing to look at anyway. And then COVID happened. And that completely upended the world economy, changed the way organisations work overnight, and really reordered the world of work. So, and it turbocharged some of the trends that we'd already seen. So the timing of this event actually turned out to be quite fortuitous because it gave us a chance to comment on some of that stuff. So that's really the areas I'm going to be covering over the next 10 minutes or so. One of the things that we looked at with this was that organisations change, people change in response to what's happening in the wider world. The shape of the workforce is changing. The old model of a unionised industrial workforce is disappearing, and we've had a massive rise in the number of professional workers and technical workers, and also in service occupations. It's the sort of hollowing out effect that people talk about. So we've had an increase in the complexity of the workforce, if you like. The other thing that's happened over the last decade or so, really since just after the financial crisis, is there have been some marked shifts in social attitudes. And what's interesting about this is that these are not just generational shifts. The old adage that social attitudes change one coffin at a time doesn't apply anymore. There is evidence that across the generations, a number of attitudes have changed. There's a great quote from Andy Beckett here, that people slowly and quietly change their minds about things without actually realising that they've done so. So if you look over the last decade, there's been a shift in attitudes to same-sex relationships, to race and ethnicity, gender equality, and the environment. This chart here is from the British Social Attitudes Survey, which takes place every year. And you can see there an evolution of an attitude to same-sex relationships, for example. And that changes slowly and then quite sharply after the financial crisis and over the last decade. And there are a number of examples of this where you can see how these sort of social attitudes have shifted quite markedly. And it's interesting that protest movements have arisen recently on questions of gender equality, the environment, race and ethnicity. They've taken a lot of people by surprise, but if you look at the trajectory of these changing attitudes over the past decade or so, perhaps they shouldn't have done. Perhaps we should have been ready for that sort of thing to happen. So the other thing that has changed in parallel with this is the expectations of companies. Quote from Gillian Tett in the Financial Times at the end of last year. She said, "Today's corporate zeitgeist is very different from what it was 2 years ago, let alone what it was like a decade ago. People are talking about corporate purpose." Mark Carney was talking about that in his speech just before Christmas, his Wreath lectures. We have Larry Fink of BlackRock putting it in the letter to his clients and chief executives. And I think that what we've noticed is that there have been movements in this direction in the past, but what is different now is the people that are saying some of this stuff. It's central bankers, it's chief executives of large organisations, senior politicians. There's a lot more talk now of things like company purpose, ESG, environmental, social and governance criteria. And this phrase that I've heard quite a lot recently, the social license to operate, the view that companies have an obligation and are operating with the social license of the wider society. And the idea that there are multiple stakeholders for a company now, including the wider community and the environment. If anybody was watching the session that we did on fair pay a few weeks ago, there was a quote from Peter Borum. Peter Borum from Mercer did quite a long piece on how the concept of fairness has changed since the financial crisis and how attitudes to what fairness means. And he said, I've had 5 times as many conversations about ESG over the last year as I had in the previous 5. So he said, this is something that he is coming up against all the time. And again, chart on the side here showing how the importance of climate change, people, that has risen up the agenda for people. This is an Ipsos Mori survey. If you look back at 2010 compared to now, people are a lot more worried about environmental questions and climate change than they were. That's why we thought these things are happening. These are reasons why the corporate environment is changing. And then COVID came along. Lockdown completely changed the way we work. The speed at which companies adapted, I think, was much greater than most people expected. There were some figures in from the IMF and from the Office for National Statistics earlier this week, which was saying that the companies responded much better to the second lockdown than most economists thought they would. So the first lockdown was a shock. The second lockdown, by that time, organisations had actually got into their stride, and the economic damage from lockdown 2 was much less severe than most experts thought it was going to be. And I think that reflects the normalisation of a lot of the technology and the ways of working that we've seen. Changes that we assumed would take many years have happened in a space of months. So a lot of the taboos around home working and remote working have disappeared. They've actually become part of normal life. This is from another Ipsos Mori survey here. Of those who've been working at home, 90% want to keep it for at least 1 day a week, and 45% want to keep it for 4 days a week. So there's evidence that people quite like working remotely. It's sort of caught the wave, and people have found certain aspects of it quite useful. The other thing to take note of is that the COVID crisis is not over yet. There were some figures from the US which were saying that there's still quite a lot of reticence for people to go back to the office, simply because people aren't yet confident that we're out of this. So Edgar Schein, the guru of organizational culture, said behavior changes when assumptions change. And if our assumptions have changed about the danger of us being infected by something, unless those assumptions change back to where they were, then our behaviors won't. So there are good reasons to think that some of what we have experienced over the last year will persist. Now, that said, there are downsides to remote working. For example, questions about strategic thinking, creativity, relationship building. Can you actually do all those sorts of things in the same way when you're not working in the same office as people, and you don't bump into people, you don't have those serendipitous conversations? So what has emerged really over the past few months is this 60-40 model. So the idea that we're going to go back to work for 60% of the time and work at home for 40% of the time, or is it the other way around? There's actually no science behind the 60-40 model. It's something that somebody came up with, and we've all seized on it because it's easy to understand. But there's no science behind any of that, and we really don't know how that will play out. So what we're seeing then is two tensions. That there's a tension between the remote working and the drive to go back to the office. There are good reasons why people want to go back and have face-to-face work. There are also good reasons why people don't want to do it all the time. The other tension for organisations is that a lot of organisations have suffered a financial hit. More than half of the hospitality industry companies have seen their turnover decline by more than 50%. A majority of companies have seen a decline in turnover of some sort. So there is this need to restore lost financial performance. But set against that, there is the desire to be seen to be doing the right thing. And there is this sense that the lockdown and the furlough and the impact of COVID has actually had more of an impact on those at the lower end of the income distribution. As Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies said, we may all be in this together, but we're not all in this equally. And you can see from the chart here that the people at the lower end of the income distribution have taken more of a hit. There's a quote here from a senior member of the official at the IMF. He was actually saying that COVID has aggravated inequalities, and we could have a vicious cycle of inequality. He actually told the Financial Times on Monday that he favoured a social solidarity tax on organisations. So there is if you like, there is a zeitgeist. There is a move there to for companies to do the right thing in the context of what has happened. So what does this mean then? I mean, what does this mean for policies? What should we do? And really, policies have got two purposes: to make sure that we are legally compliant, and that we take a consistent approach to things. But also, policies give us a chance to transmit and embed a culture. So they give us a chance to signal what the organisation values, what it's for. So there's an opportunity as well as a threat in terms of policies. They're important for internal management of a company, but also important for external relationships. So they give us a chance to say, what is this company about? And the challenge is to do the second without losing track of the first. So given the changes that we've seen, given the fact that there have been changes in social attitudes, there have been changes in the expectations of companies, that COVID has changed the world of work, it's changed the expectations of employees and of the society in which companies operate. Anybody with a blog or a Twitter account now is capable of creating a social media storm if they can get the right sort of traction for it. The boss of KPMG will no doubt attest to that, as he was ended up resigning after comments that he made on an internal Zoom meeting. So the scrutiny of companies now is much higher than it has ever been. Anti-corporate rhetoric is becoming normalised, even from our Prime Minister, as it happens. I won't repeat what he said because we're before the 9 o'clock watershed. But policies are going to be increasingly part of the employee value proposition and part of the brand, as well as having an internal application. So customers, prospective employees, journalists will ask, what is your policy on? And that might be whatever the latest thing in the news is. So we need to have in organisations a consistent approach to policies, and to be able to build policies that actually tell something about who we are and what the company values, and to transmit that to employees, to customers, to the rest of the world, as well as simply being for compliance and keeping us out of court.
Thanks for that, Steve. So when we originally contemplated running this session, this was pre-COVID, and our view was that policies are really important, but they're very often neglected. And they're important for the reasons that Steve said, because some you have to have for legal reasons, and the others because they define good practice. But it just seems to us that there's a whole host of things here which are neglected in policies. And the bleat that you often hear from people in organisations, give me a clue as to how my pay works, how do I get paid and how do I get paid more? And the other element would be about how do I get promoted, how do I get developed? And how does succession management fit with job posting and so on? And it just seems that this is an area which, if done well, clarifies expectations for employees. But very often it's not. It's passed to somebody who's too junior to make an impact. And then when we were thinking about these issues, COVID hit us. And of course, that immediately did a couple of things. One, it told us that we had to do things in a different way. We had to comply with certain requirements. We had to manage and run businesses differently. But the other element to it, which is really quite exciting, is it opened up opportunities. You know, the way we design work, the way that we design contracts of employment, all of these kind of things. And so I was really rather intrigued by Steve's paper that he produced. And just before passing on to Elizabeth, just wanted to take one or two comments, one or two views from people in the audience. So if anybody's got a few, please let us have it. It's just going to break the session up a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So I guess a couple of thoughts from me. Firstly, an interesting start from Stephen, so thanks for that. I'm reminded of a previous boss that used to say the problem with policies and having them is that you've then got to follow them. And that, of course, does box people in quite a bit, when actually, in fact, flexibility is quite useful, as we all know, in the reward space to fit the issues. One of the questions for me, I suppose, as I hear Stephen's presentation is, are companies leading with policies, or are policies catching up where they want to be? So I suppose I'm just quite curious as to whether people observe that a company tries to change some of the culture, and I completely agree that's a critical word, almost clandestinely by changing the policies, then all of a sudden they pop up and, oh, look, that's now defined the culture. Or are people driving a culture and then using the policies to reinforce that? And I think that I'm at Fidelity International, so an asset manager, culture hasn't, is relatively new in the sense we've had a culture, but we're trying to freshen it and become a little more progressive. So, for example, last year we launched something called an EPL, an enhanced paternity leave, where we equalised in all of our jurisdictions around the world the paternity leave for males and females. Now, we did that because we thought it was the right thing to do, but then we made a real big song and dance of it externally as well, because we're trying to position ourselves quite differently, a little bit of the EVP and the culture point that Stephen was raising. So we're trying to use that as an example of how we are different in the financial services sector, particularly in the asset management sector. It was almost a sort of a little poster child, as it were, if you excuse the pun in that context. So I'd be interested to know whether people find changing policies is catching up to where they want to go in culture, or whether people are using it to lead where people want to go in culture.
We have that as an open question from Martin to the rest of the group. Anybody got a comment on that?
Hi, everyone. I thought it was a really good question, Martin. And as somebody who works for Natura & Co., which is a B Corp, and so triple bottom line, focusing on people, planet and profit, it's something which has been kind of taxing us. I'm not sure if it's kind of an answer, but for example, we've been revisiting the famous car allowances and good old company cars in the context of A, people not commuting, but B, saying, shouldn't we be signaling that this is more about agile working and green commuting? It's a bit of a mouthful for a kind of benefit, but I think it speaks to your point, Martin. So it's kind of, I think, a bit of both. Benefits and policy should definitely, to my mind, be culture carriers. But does the culture come first, or do you use them to help generate the culture change?
I think that's two really interesting observations, and we could spend a bit more time delving into those, and maybe we'll come back to that later on. But we have a couple of company speakers later on, so we can have a roundup session later on where we talk about that and other issues. But in the interest of time, wanted to pass to Elizabeth from Eversheds, and Steve Toft said that she was a huge contributor to the report that was produced. And so, Elizabeth, do you want to give us a legal view from Evershed's perspective?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Steve, for your kind words on the report as well, and welcome all this evening to you. I'm Elizabeth Graves, and I'm an employment lawyer at Eversheds.Sutherland, and I act for companies around the world managing all their global employment needs, which often involves the delivery of policies. Now, it might be a surprise to you to know that as an employment lawyer, I tend to take a deep breath when a new client says to me, can we have a fee quote for a review of your employment policies? It's not that I don't want the business, I'm a lawyer, of course I do. But it's a bit like asking a designer to redesign your wardrobe without having met you. I can check for your frays and tears and patch those up. If you're moving from California to the UK, I can tell you need a heavy winter coat for cold weather. But what I can't do is redesign your collection without knowing who you want to be, how you want to spend your time, and the special occasions you might need to attend. Now, ask me instead to be your legal partner on a How to Fix the Foundations project, which involves a holistic review of your contracts and policies to bring you up to date with the organisation you've become. And that's where I think lawyers can really help you. And why is that? Well, if we go back to basics, there's actually not that much you need to do to be legally compliant with your policies. And Steve's report sets out the absolute basics. And if we can just turn to the first slide, please. we've just set out on the next slide that, the bare essentials that you need as an employer to be legally compliant in the UK, and it's not very much. So the Employment Rights Act requires you to identify in your written statement of particulars to employees what your rules are on disciplinaries and how to raise grievances. So that means you need a disciplinary and grievance policy. You have to tell them about your terms regarding sickness absence and pensions. Much easier to put that in a policy than fill up the contract. And if you've got more than 5 employees, then you need a general health and safety policy. And later this year in December, all employers with 50 or more employees in EU member states will have to have whistleblowing channels. So if you haven't got one already, you will need to have a whistleblowing policy. But beyond that, there isn't that much that is legally essential. So what is it that lawyers get excited about? Well, it's the other 20 or more policies that we probably encourage you to have that may sit on your intranet or your policy manual and have historically been there for 2 reasons. The first is because you as employers make benefits available to employees or opportunities, and they need to know about those, how to access them, what and when they can have them. It could be training, it could be enhanced family leave. And of course, the more you provide those, the more you want to regulate and set terms around them. And the second is because you need to give instructions to employees about how to behave, what's appropriate at work and what isn't, and how you'd address that with non-compliance. And it's that second category, I think, that's really been growing as successive UK governments have increased the compliance requirements for employers. So your policy, supplemented by the training that you give people, are how you ensure that you are compliant with that sort of wave of legal compliance legislation. It could be Bribery Act, it could be cybersecurity, data protection, and most recently corporate tax evasion and the IR35 tax regime. And your policies there are really helpful, as Steve mentioned earlier, to keep you out of court, because many of those types of legislation give you some kind of defence where you can say that as an employer, you took reasonable steps to avoid the kind of behaviour that is falling foul of the legislation, and you call out your policy in order to explain that. But I think it's that third type of policy that Steve has been talking about earlier that I'm seeing more and more of now, which really is about organisations promoting perhaps how they are diverse and inclusive, or their ESG agenda. I've seen recently employers adopting the Halo Code on black hair, introducing policies for people who want to transition gender at work and getting those things right. It's quite sensitive and difficult. And so we're seeing this move away from those basics that regulate things, that define conduct and keep you out of court, towards these more external policies. So I just want to take a snapshot, if we could move to the next slide, please, of where I think most employers are at the moment. I hesitate to say a post-COVID world. We're not there yet, are we? Thinking about behaviours and assumptions, as Steve mentioned earlier. But a little bit like Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol, I'm just going to visit on you for a moment the ghost of policies past, present and future. So my observation is that for the last 12 months, organisations have been caught up in a reactive storm by which they've pasted sticking plasters all over their organisations to manage the effects of COVID-19. So a couple of bullet points which the HR director had to put together last March have become a vital policy for the temporary pandemic, whether that's extra paid childcare days off, how to get your ergonomic chair sent to you at home, or actually quite existential issues like your temporary remote working policy that a large part of your organisation has been operating under for 12 months, or how you've made the workplace COVID secure, or even which parts of your organisation move on to the government's furlough scheme and what levels of pay you're going to do with those. And I don't think we're quite out of that yet, but those sticking plasters in some cases are going to be quite painful to rip off. Most notably, those people who have been working from home and who may be reluctant to come back to the office environment. So where I'd say we are in the present now is most organisations are working on developing what they hope are future-proof policies that will support whatever their post-pandemic model of working is going to be. And that's where I would encourage all of you to focus now, because I think getting that right involves quite a deep analysis of how your proposed business model is going to work. Now, some people have already ripped up the flexible working policy, and you've seen employers like Standard Chartered come out saying you can work where you like, when you like. And that has gone down very well and received a lot of positive attention. Now, it may not be quite as simple as it looks. And when you dig behind what the press reports actually mean, I think you will find some restrictions on that apparently great freedom. You know, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean you can work wherever you like outside the UK. And I'm certainly seeing employers thinking about that and having policies where perhaps work abroad would be permitted for up to 30 days to manage tax risks. So the dilemma facing all of us in this brave new world is really how much decision making is devolved to individual employees, how much is retained centrally, or perhaps allowed to line managers to decide what proportion of people's working time is spent where in the new normal. How is that governance documented? So is it going to be spelt out in every individual's employment contract exactly what proportion of their time they need to spend where? Or will you keep your standard contracts and use your policies to give you the flexibility and those new foundations that you need? And I think that could be done through updating a flexible working policy, or it could be an entirely new remote working policy. But also I think organisations are struggling with how individual requests get handled, or whether they actually take the initiative and impose these structures on employees, which could in some case involve some quite complex consultation requirements. And those policies need to think about a huge range of issues, health and safety, equipment and IT, mental health support, expenses, and perhaps most challenging of all is the reward structure. And what I have seen labelled as the choice between location pay or role-based pay. So if you allow somebody who's traditionally been based in an expensive office in London, having to pay for a mortgage on a property in London or commuting in, to do that same job from deepest, darkest Devon, should they get the same rate of pay for that, or should the pay reflect where the job is now based? And having a global policy to cover all of those issues is quite difficult. And I think that what you can probably do at the best level with a global policy is set a framework and then have a more localized approach underneath. So alongside all of that, I'd encourage you to consider what changes are needed to the rest of your policies to support or align with your new post-COVID working model. So for example, if you've got a disciplinary or grievance policy to be legally compliant that says an employee has to come to a stage 1 or a stage 2 meeting, what do you actually mean by a meeting in the future? Is that an online Zoom? Or is that actually the sort of important meeting where an individual would have to come face to face into the office? And are you going to write those sort of requirements into contractual obligations, or are they going to sit in policy? So I think that the more you creep outside what you see as the core policies to implement the new ways of working, the more you'll find you need to make changes. Now, my favourite employment lawyer comment of the pandemic came from a judge at the Central London Tribunal, who was talking in one breath about how successful virtual hearings had been, and then in a second, just making a plea to parties and their representatives if they could please refrain from attending virtual hearings in their dressing gowns. So we set our new policy about where people work, but we've got to think about all the other things that sit around that. And I'm sure if we all took a look at our organisation's dress code policy at the moment, it would probably in no way reflect the sort of changes that we've seen and that Steve was talking about in the last 12 months. And I think then once you've settled on that new fundamental working model and made the essential changes to implement that, then I would say in the future is the time to do the drains up review that the report talks about of all of your policies. So if we could just move forward to the next slide, please. I'm just going to share with you some of what I would say are the legal pitfalls to avoid when you come to thinking about policies. So the main problems I see as an employment lawyer with policies are, first of all, what's called contractualizing it, which is that you set in place something that was meant to be flexible, and suddenly you found that it's become so rigid in your organisation that through custom and practice or reference in other documents, it's actually become something you're bound by. And outside a unionised environment, I actually think those incidents where you are legally bound are fairly rare. Now, the second thing, and Mike touched on this at the beginning, is the difficulty of being inconsistent in following your own policy as an employer. And if you do that without good reason, then that will lose you tribunal claims, whether it's discrimination or unfair dismissal. And then the third legal pitfall I just urge you to think about is one that I've seen more recently, and it's what I would call an oversimplification exercise. So a number of organisations I work with have been through agile transformations in recent years. They've been very successful in making a cultural mindset, and that quite often moves on to what's called a policy simplification exercise to try and move red tape and empower people, often moving away from a telling culture towards partnership. But I've seen, unfortunately, a bit of fallout from those exercises where people lose the clear rules and bright lines that they need to operate. One large organisation found a senior manager in the middle of a Bribery Act investigation because, unfortunately, he had been involved in reimbursing hospitality expenses and accepting lunches from vendors that actually most senior management within the organisation have become unclear about as having a result of an oversimplification of the hospitality policy. So then finally, just touching on that issue of custom and practice, there is always a risk that something that has been the same for a long time will become an implied term of employees' employment. And actually outside the unionised environment, the main area where that comes up is in relation to enhanced redundancy payments. And we've got some clear case law there that suggests that for something to become a contractual term, it has to be reasonable, notorious and certain, which basically means everyone needs to know about it. And it must be reasonable to include the employer meant to be bound by that custom. And that leaves you in a difficult situation where you might need individual agreement or even collective agreement with your union. And Martin Warren will be able to talk to you about his wealth of experience in union collective agreements becoming contractual terms there. So the best way to manage those risks is the very obvious one of stating in your documents that they're non-contractual. But I think also making sure that you do always think about whether we should continue doing the same thing we've done before. If we can just go on to the last slide now. Karen's going to talk about the 10 questions you should ask yourself during a policy review. And I've set out some pointers in the slide here, but I think the one thing that I would ask you each to take away in your policies is just the importance of regularly reviewing and refreshing them. Because as an employment lawyer, there's nothing more embarrassing for my clients than sitting in an employment tribunal, facing a horrible harassment or whistleblowing or discrimination claim and being presented with your own policy that is totally out of date and has the contact details of someone who left 10 years ago, which really tells the judge that this is not something that you take seriously.
Brilliant. That was very clear, well delivered, and lots of practical advice and guidance. Martin, I expect you've got some comments on that, have you?
Yeah, I can comment fairly briefly, Mike. I guess from working with clients over many years, sort of a few practical stroke legal observations, and you've alluded to a couple of them. I think the first thing I've seen in practice a lot over the years is over-delegation in policy drafting, policy formation. It gets pushed down the food chain, and perhaps there could be more checking and more detail when the draft policy comes back out of the relevant team. So I think that there's historically some of the problems I've seen, it's policies being put together with the people without enough experience to really understand some of the issues that they're dealing with the best will in the world. I think linked to that, draft, and Lizzie's alluded to this, but draft every policy on the basis that one day you might have to put it in front of a journalist, an employment judge, the Central Arbitration Committee, take your pick. And if you were drafting an important and sensitive press release, you'd make sure you spent the time and effort on it. I think when drafting a policy, you're drafting a document which is increasingly in the public domain. And Steve's report picks this up too. Third point I'd make is that when looking at policies more generally, your organisation may well be part of a trade association, some form of maybe international. You may have signed up to the UN Global Compact or some other set of standards that you aspire to as a company. The UN Global Compact for international companies is a classic one. You will have committed as a company to certain things. If you've done that, your policies need to be consistent with your external promises. And quite often there's a divide between internal policy drafting and external public commitments. And if you look at the UN Global Compact, and certainly in my area of work, labour relations, collective bargaining and promotion of collective bargaining, which is principle 3, there can be tensions between that and what is put in-country policies. 4th point would be, and we've touched on this, I think Martin from the audience, international consistency. International companies want policies that apply across jurisdiction. What's lawful in one jurisdiction may either be unlawful or perceived to be mean in another. So at the international level, increased care about putting something together which is not a hostage to fortune. Again, I've seen it in my work over the years, particularly US versus UK in labour relations. And they're very different jurisdictions, and it's hard to get a policy for the middle ground. And then the last point, Mike, I'd make, which Lizzie ended with, is the dangers of avoiding contractualisation. It's very easy to make policies contractual by mistake, inadvertently, and that then causes major problems in terms of changing them. And certainly from a labour lawyer's point of view, as well as an employment lawyer's, I can't see any gain in having a policy contractual. I can see lots of advantages in having a policy non-contractual.
Thanks. Very thoughtful as expected, Martin. Thanks for that. Just let's go back to the audience now, just to vary the pace a little bit. Questions, comments from the audience. Got here one just to get us going from Stephanie. She says, I find often what's missing is the support in the application of the policy, management guidance, training, etc. Often it's more of a culture shift that's needed, and a policy doesn't fix that. Clearly. So it goes back to that point about what comes first, the policies or the acts. So some comments from the audience before we move on.
Just a thought on that last point, Mike, that Martin was making around international policies. Certainly in my previous job, I found, although we said, well, we can't possibly make policies that are applicable in, say, the US and the UK, and then we had differences thinking around labour organisation. It came back to haunt us because, people talk to each other across those boundaries now, and they want to hold the company up and say, where do you stand on this? So policy or no policy, you'll be, held to account for your behaviours.
And really, going back to Elizabeth, so you gave us a very rich presentation there. And if you had, some 2 or 3 little nuggets for this group of people assembled in front of you, what would you urge them to do?
I would suggest you spend time thinking about the new normal and how you're going to do it, and don't be rushed into what your policies are going to be by other people getting out ahead of you. I mean, just anecdotally, in law firms, I think everybody thought we were all going for the 60-40 model that Steve spoke about, and then one law firm came out saying it's going to let their employees work 50% from home, and everybody sort of went back to their policies again and looked at them. But I think it's going to be much better there to build something that will be future-proof than a quick knee-jerk reaction by just updating what's been the temporary policy. I think the other one that is really worth a dust off of at the moment too, in fact, would be the equal opportunities policy, which is something that organisations have had for a long time, and matching that up to their diversity and inclusion strategy, because I think the two are often quite misaligned at the moment. And then thirdly, I talked a little bit about whistleblowing policies. I think organisations put those policies in place off the shelf and don't actually think through carefully how they're going to manage those, matching them up to their sort of ethics and compliance programme, having a clear triage process between what goes through a grievance process and what would actually go into compliance investigation teams or even externally. So those would be my practical tips.
Yeah, that's really useful. Really very rich session there. Thank you very much. And thanks, Martin, for your comments. What we're going to do now is we've got 3 vignettes from some of the members, and we've got one from Tesco, one from Severn Trent, and one from Mediabrands. And Mustafa, I think you've volunteered to give us a view of what's taking place in Tesco, which we're very interested to hear about. Over to you.
I have, yes. I've been asked to speak about Tesco's employment policy response to COVID-19. And I think most of you will know Tesco, but just a bit of context about our business. So we have a number of brands that we operate in a number of markets, including most recently Asia and Central Europe, although we have just sold the Asian and the Polish business. But across the world, we're around 367,000 employees, albeit the vast majority in the UK, around 3,500 stores, and our financials, which were just published today, actually, 53 billion in sales, the vast majority of which are in the UK. Those of you watching the news will have seen that actually our profits have dipped as a result of COVID, which perhaps many people didn't expect. But while sales were up definitely around 7%, profits were actually down 15% due to the social distancing measures we've had to put in place, which anybody who's a shopper in the UK probably would have seen, but also as a result of some of the people policy initiatives we had to take around sickness absence, which I'll talk about now in a second. So here's a timeline of the various kind of events that have happened that have forced policy responses from us. The major one obviously being the 23rd of March 2020, which is when the first lockdown was announced. And the government announced that a new category of people, clinically vulnerable, and a subcategory, clinically extremely vulnerable people, would have to stay at home if they couldn't work from home. Now for Tesco, that comprised some 26,000 people, which is about 10% of everybody who works in stores. So overnight, we kind of were faced with 10% of our workforce being absent. And by around the 31st of May, when you combined those people with the people who were off short term as a result of being diagnosed with COVID or having COVID symptoms, we're up to about 15% absence, which is around 50,000 colleagues being off. So within a period of about 5 weeks, we had to recruit the same number of temps to kind of cover that backlog. From June, we were then permitted to kind of bring some of those clinically vulnerable people back to work, and we put them through an occupational health referral process to determine, are they at kind of high, medium or low risk in relation to COVID? So for those that were low risk, they went back to their regular roles. But for those that were medium or high risk, we put in some additional controls for them. So things like wearing face visors, working in back of house areas that are less kind of busy, and possibly working at different times that were less busy too, to try and mitigate the impact of coming into contact with customers or colleagues who perhaps unknowingly were carrying COVID and risk transmitting that onto kind of some vulnerable colleagues. In July then, I think everybody will recall that face covering then became mandatory in shops. So whilst we were encouraging colleagues to wear them prior to that, as of July, it then became compulsory. I think it's fair to say we probably had more aggravation about this than any other issue during COVID. Lots of people were very unhappy about having to wear a face mask for kind of 7, 6, 8 hours a day, particularly in the heat in the summer, and they were quite upset about it. We did manage to get most people to wear them, but we had a number of colleagues say that they had hidden disabilities that meant that they were unable to wear a face covering. Whilst we did ask some of them to wear a sunflower lanyard, which indicated they had a hidden disability, some were unwilling to do even that. So, we had a bit of a torrid time with a certain minority of colleagues. From August then, things seemed to be getting back to normal, and the clinically extremely vulnerable colleagues were allowed to return. But then from November, we saw the kind of second wave, and those colleagues then had to go back to shielding. Many of them were quite frustrated, actually. They actually wanted to be at work, a lot of them, and didn't want to stay at home. But we kind of took the view that around about that time, we were seeing the South African variant and other variants of the disease. So we kind of took the view that we had to protect these people from themselves and say, no, I'm sorry, if you fall into this category, you have to stay at home and we will pay you, rather than you coming to work, even if you want to kind of forego that. Also, you may remember that Tesco decided at that point to return the rates relief that was given by the government to all retailers, which was some £500 million for Tesco. So all of this support that you'd have seen for clinically vulnerable colleagues staying at home, we didn't take a penny of government support to facilitate that. We didn't make use of the furlough scheme. We took a very early principled decision to say that the furlough scheme was there for businesses that were kind of severely negatively impacted by COVID, and that given that we were allowed to continue trading, that it wasn't right for us to make use of that scheme. So we did all that kind of from our own funds. And then a further kind of policy development that came out really close to Christmas, around the 23rd of December, which I must admit I'd missed and my team kind of missed really until January, was the requirement for pregnant colleagues who were at or more than 28 weeks of pregnancy to be placed on paid maternity suspension, in addition to those that were higher risk. So throughout this pandemic, we'd have been including high-risk pregnancy colleagues in the clinically vulnerable category and paying them to stay at home on average pay until the 4th week prior to their expected week of childbirth. But we were now required to then place all pregnant colleagues at 28 weeks on maternity suspension, which is about another, at any given time, it's another 1,000 colleagues who fall pregnant at any one time. So that was an additional kind of consideration. And then on top of that, in February, the government then created a new algorithm that added more people to the shielding list. So this was some 2,000 people who, prior to this, bearing in mind, had been at work pretty much since March, were now told that they were extremely vulnerable and had to shield. So again, a lot of these people really didn't want to shield at home and did want to continue coming to work. But again, we suggested that they should go home and be paid for that. Happily now things are kind of returning to normal, more so than not. So most of these clinically vulnerable colleagues have now returned. We had various different dates in April in the various devolved nations where they can now return to work. So our absence is now, down to about, it's around 1% for COVID-related absence and 3% for non-COVID related, which is kind of at a normal level. So I've just highlighted here on the final slide, just some key issues from a policy perspective that we faced that I've mentioned in the timeline. The key one obviously was in relation to our sickness absence policy. So like many organisations, we had a policy that said if you are sick, then you will not be paid for the first 3 days of that sickness as part of what are called waiting days. And that sick pay will only really come in from the 4th day of any sickness. And the intent behind that is to deter non-genuine sickness from being paid. Now, clearly in a situation where we have a contagious virus, it's not in anybody's interest for people to then come into work during those 3 days if they have symptoms and then go on to infect others. So again, we took a very early decision to say, well, no, we'll waive the waiting days, and anybody with COVID symptoms or obviously a confirmed COVID diagnosis would be paid from day one. And that was without requiring any evidence in the form of, a test or a doctor's note or anything like that. We took that on trust. We also then extended that sick pay for people who needed to self-isolate, even if they didn't have an entitlement. So for those people who didn't have it for length of service, or maybe they'd finished their sick pay entitlement, we said that we would continue to pay them sick pay for however long they needed to self-isolate. Again, so that, we weren't encouraging those people to come to work because of financial reasons. And obviously we weren't including any COVID-related absence in any sickness absence performance management triggers. For the clinically vulnerable and the clinically extremely vulnerable colleagues that I mentioned earlier, initially for the first 12 weeks, we paid that as kind of out with sick pay, i.e. it was just paid as a kind of a flat rate contractual pay. We then changed that after 12 weeks to say, well, it's going to come out of your sick pay allowance, but where your sick pay then finishes, we will then extend that until the government says you can return to work. We did, however, kind of top that up with 2 days leave being used every month, which was kind of a mix of cost management, but also saying, well, we didn't want you then to kind of come back to work and then have 15, 20, 25 days of leave to use as well. So we required those colleagues to take 2 days of leave for every month that they were absent. And as I mentioned, we implemented paid maternity suspension for pregnant colleagues, which I knew nothing about before COVID, but apparently it's a feature of the Management of Health and Safety at Work regs and the Employment Rights Act that we had to go and quickly find out about and implement at short notice. Face coverings, I mentioned, were initially voluntary, but then became mandatory. We only actually had one dismissal for a colleague who was non-compliant. As I mentioned, any colleague who said that they've got a valid exemption as per the regulations, whether that's a disability or some other medical condition, we didn't require them to provide evidence of that. We offered to refer them to occupational health if they wanted to provide some kind of evidence in case they were challenged by the police. But by and large, we kind of took that at face value. We did have one colleague, however, who'd said that we were breaching her human rights to breathe fresh air. And we said that wasn't sadly covered by the exemptions. So we had to dismiss her. Upon appeal, she then said that she did actually have a medical condition that she'd previously not disclosed to us. So again, we took that at face value and reinstated her. And then finally, on annual leave, I mean, this was a bit more of a controversial one for our office colleagues. We traditionally have had a policy that says We will not let you carry over any annual leave beyond the end of the leave year. We want you to take that for reasons of kind of, fatigue and well-being. A lot of our office colleagues kind of wanted to carry over days because they weren't able to make use of their leave to go kind of on foreign holidays, but we stuck rigidly to that. And also more contentiously, for those office colleagues who were able to travel abroad during that period in the early part of the year, where quarantine was then required on return, even though all of our office colleagues were working from home, we took a decision to say, well, if you decide to go on a foreign holiday during this time, which is against the advice of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, then you will not be able to work from home to fulfill that quarantine period. You will need to take extra leave to cover that quarantine, or you'll need to take it as unpaid. And our reason for that was we didn't really want to kind of encourage people to travel against government advice, but also we felt that for office colleagues, whilst they could work from home, our store and distribution colleagues couldn't avail themselves of that. So it was kind of unfair to offer it to office colleagues. So that was, again, something we had a bit of contention about during that period. So those are the main kind of policy issues we faced. Clearly now the things we're facing into are returning to the office, what portion of work people do in and out of the office, and also unwinding some of these sickness absence policies in terms of at what point do we say with COVID-related absences business as usual, and we won't necessarily top up the sick pay, etc. That is something that we're probably going to have to make a call on as the pandemic develops and as government guidance changes. Equally, we still have 1,000 people off due to pregnancy being at more than 28 weeks. Again, at some point, we hope that will return to normal. But again, we're kind of beholden to government advice on that. So we'll have to keep on waiting and watching to see what develops on that front. So those are some of the highlights. Happy to take questions or comments if there are any.
Yeah, that's really good, Mustafa. I suggest what we do in interest of time is that we hear from our other two colleagues before we coming back to questions. I would have loads of questions on what you've just said, but I'm not going to hog the microphone. But just going to pass very quickly to Nicole from Severn Trent. Nicole, what's going on in Severn Trent?
Hi there. So we had actually a really interesting to see Tesco's journey there, because ours is really similar. So exactly the same on the 4 areas that have just been talked about. I suppose what we had in the early part of last year was all those colleagues that were furloughed had the opportunity to enjoy some absolutely fantastic weather. We had a perfect storm in the water industry where you had schools closed, everybody at home, beautiful weather. The provision of water was the highest demand that the country had ever seen. So we had the dilemma of having to produce more water with less staff, with people working remotely. So it was quite hard to do. And I think the one thing that I would build on the 4 points we talked about was the use of our facilities and the use of our sites. And what that drove us to do is we had about half of our workforce, so around 3,500 people that just continued, their job just continued as it was. It was about fixing leaks. It was about going into customers' premises and making sure water was safe and producing water. And they went to work every day. They came home every evening. And we had the dilemma there of them being safe to come home to their family, but also that we had to help them create a really strong work bubble so that they didn't we could have had the way that COVID spread, we could have had a situation that multiple people were off on the same site at any one time. So we locked down our sites of critical national infrastructure to those people, and we concentrated on them. We had some of our teams that were out and about that faced abuse from customers in the street. So customers telling them they shouldn't be out in the streets, they should be staying at home. But you had that situation where you had to go into a customer's house to help make sure they got water supply, but then they were both putting themselves at risk, but the customer almost felt that they were putting them at risk as well. So we had all these situations to try to navigate with PPE, with around our approach. So how do you ask somebody to come out of their house so we can go in, or go into a different part of the house? So that got all quite difficult. But we also faced the same dilemma of Tesco's, that we had half of our workforce at home and half of them in our sites, and it was around making sure that you respected the work that both people would do. And what we found of people at home is they were telling us that they were suffering from real fatigue from the volume of work that they were doing, the volume of hours that they were working, and the types of different situations. And we found ourselves having to really think about the jobs that we needed people to do, and also to a degree asking people to do different things at different times. So if we were stopping doing certain work, we're asking people to adjust their duties. So we didn't actually, on reflection, change our policies in any great deal, with the exception of the ones that have just been talked around with Tesco's, with absence and annual leave. But what we did do is we found we adapted and developed some new policies. So we developed, for example, our policy on how we might support colleagues during situations of domestic violence, because we were having people that needed to come into the workplace because home wasn't really a great place for them to be. We had to develop our policies to make sure that they were representative of what some of our LGBTQ plus colleagues might be facing in a home environment where their sexuality wasn't accepted by their parents, for example. And they were the things that really challenged us. So it was much more cultural. And I think we talked earlier a little bit from, I think it was Martin that said around whether your policy was your driver for your cultural change. But what we found that we had to do with our policies was put some guardrails around what we could help people to do, the environment we could give them that made them continue to be safe and well. And actually, they're the things that we've kept, and they're the things that we've grown. And the other thing that I noticed about some of our policies and the team that helped to define some of those policies is some of our policies were written in a way to stop people abusing them or gaming them. So we actually changed the emphasis on a number of our policies, which was more about the language that we used in them, the way that they were more supportive. And if there was somebody that was using the policy inappropriately, we took that to task. So we changed some of our language around them, but the actual essence of our policies and the way that we worked were really, really fit for purpose. And we got some really great feedback from our employees about the experience that they'd had and the way that they were supported and the guidance that we'd given around multiple situations. And we're going to continue to do that. So it's been a really good learning period for testing how our policies operate and the types of things that we might do for the future.
That's great. And third case study is Alistair Proctor from Mediabrands. Alistair?
Hi, Mike. Thank you very much. I'll try and keep this brief. Just for everyone's benefit, in case you don't know, Mediabrands is a global marketing communications, I suppose, set of agencies mainly focused on media, but operating in a sort of broader advertising space. We've got about 12,500, 13,000 employees globally, headquartered in the US. So it's quite interesting. I mean, fascinating discussion, actually, just listening to everything and the points that have been made. We found ourselves in a situation where we effectively, the pandemic and the aftermath of, well, what's still going on, and how we foresee the kind of future of hybrid working has required us to do a fairly major review of a number of our policies. And actually, once we started looking at them, I think we've found actually that, pretty much everything needs some form of update or review, or, we've just got big gaps everywhere. So to Martin's earlier question, I think I'd agree with Bola that I think, it is a case of being both reactive, whether you're sort of responding to kind of tax regulation and so forth that you need to account for, or whether you're trying to kind of lead in some way and sort of reflect the culture you want to be, just things like our internal transfer policy and, how we handle sort of internal poaching, that sort of thing, which is not specific to the pandemic or COVID, but nonetheless, we've kind of realized that, a lot of our policies have been sort of gathering dust on the shelf for so long. that pretty much everything needs review for one reason or another. Specific to sort of the future, if you like, and we're sort of now, like probably many of you, working through, what hybrid will look like for us, and to what extent we legislate via policy and what we don't. I can't honestly say that we've cracked it yet. It's very much a work in progress. I think, we're looking at many of the things probably you all are already. So, everything from, T&E to, health and safety, working hours, equipment, home office type stuff, holidays, performance management, what requirements would be, or how would we define a need for someone to be in an office on any given day? What events would trigger a sort of, if you like, a necessity to sort of insist on that? And then things like, how we just manage, the fact that many of our officers, if everyone pitched up on the same day, for example, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, wouldn't be able to cope with the simple number of people, because we've been downsizing real estate or are planning to do so. So a lot of huge number of sort of practical considerations that we're still working through. And, some of the points that have already been touched on by other speakers today have come very much into focus. So things like, to what extent should a policy be global, or to what extent do we allow for local differentiation? And I think sometimes, we've really got to consider sort of local cultural influences as well, and cultural norms, and what might be appropriate in one place may simply not be appropriate elsewhere. So we're having to sort of take those things into account. And I think this whole question around freedom and the extent to which you sort of, how much freedom do you allow and flexibility versus how much kind of control do you maintain, is also something we've debated quite a lot. And we've seen even then quite a lot of difference from geography to geography. Some of our markets, want to be much less prescriptive, and others more so. But I think in many cases, in order to sort of avoid our policies becoming too cumbersome and too lengthy, which somebody I think mentioned earlier as well, we are sort of looking at developing more guidelines for managers particularly. And I think, the challenge with a lot of this in terms of implementation and kind of just living and working with these policies will be with our sort of middle management population, and how they respond, how they adopt, understand, and live out, and kind of manage through situations that you simply can't legislate for, in policies, or you'll be writing kind of a, something of biblical proportions on every single item. I think again, just thinking about the work that we've been doing and where we're at, I think, the question around, how does your policy support the culture and values you want to have as an organization is a really good kind of test as you're drafting a policy, whether or not you're on the right lines. I think that's a super question to consider, and it should, I think, be almost an automatic one we ask. And then I must say, we have seen over the last, year or so, so many occasions when someone has said, what's your policy on X and what's your policy on Y? And again, I think that's, those sorts of queries are good ways of surfacing where we've got gaps, where we really haven't got a policy, or we haven't thought about something, and we need to be more proactive and have a position. The only sort of problem with that sometimes, I think, is that the reality is that our policy changes as events change around us. Certainly the last year and a half has taught us that, what might have been our policy 6 months ago may no longer be the case. So again, one has to be a little bit careful with that sort of thing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alistair. So there are loads of questions to our three speakers. And this is, Mustafa, you sparked this off. How do you determine policies? How do you communicate them? How do you review them? And how do you cost them? Can you give a one-sentence answer?
Tesco actually do it very well. I've only joined Tesco about 18 months ago, but in total, we've got about 70 policies, which I thought was too many. But actually, after I joined, I realised actually it's what managers want. So, I'd kind of come from a place where I said, look, we've got too many policies and they're too prescriptive. Can we not kind of, make these shorter and give managers more latitude? But actually, having dealt with managers at Tesco, store managers, distribution managers, they're not office-based, they're, in a store, in a warehouse. They just want to be told, tell me what to do, just give me a checklist. I don't want the discretion. I haven't got time to make that judgment. So, for that reason, our policies are quite prescriptive. And in terms of the costings, we kind of use a shorthand of most of our colleagues are part-time. So whenever costing, things like how much would it cost for us to pay everybody to be absent for another week? We generally cost an average of 22 hours a week is what store workers work. An average of £9.30 an hour is what they're paid. You multiply it up and it gives you a number and you say, well, that's what it's going to cost. And actually, being in retail, you have to make those decisions using rules of thumbs quite rapidly. So we did that quite well.
Yeah, brilliant answer. Thanks for keeping it short. So what I suggest we do is move to Karen really quickly, and then at the end of that, if you've got any questions, stick them on the chat line, and we'll come to them at the end of the session. Thanks, Karen. Over to you.
So what we've done is we've put together 10 questions, which, assuming you now feel motivated or encouraged to do a policy review, we hope this is sort of a good starter for 10 for you. And I guess these questions would be asked in the broader context as suggested by Elizabeth and Stephen around future-proofing, changing social attitudes of your talent, stakeholders and customers, and also the media. Your own corporate purpose and goals for the culture and EVP as opposed to following the crowd or doing what everyone else in your sector is. Paying attention, of course, to the relevant legislation, which is impacting your own business because of the sector that you're in. And also Martin's point around, avoiding contractualization of your policies. So the 10 questions, and I'll quick fire through these. They'll also be available to review at the back of Steve and Elizabeth's report. 1, what is the need for a policy in this specific area, and what are the risks of not having one? How does this policy support and enhance our business model and strategy? And again, there the focus is on your own business model and strategy as opposed to trying to follow what your competitors are doing for the wrong reasons. Does the policy have global or country-specific application, which I think also plays back to Alistair's point about the global versus local and paying attention to the requirements of both? Does the policy align with or amend our own employee value proposition? When this policy becomes public, what will it tell people about our company, and how does it affect our social license to operate? And again, that's coming back to taking account of the changing social attitudes of all the different stakeholders to your business. Question 6, does it translate into measurable criteria? Can we monitor the impact or the extent of compliance? Number 7, do employees generally within our company understand how this policy relates to their role and responsibilities? And on that point, who's going to be the custodian of each policy? Who's going to be accountable for communicating it to who and how? And is it more than one person? And I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that policy can be in the book or on the intranet, but how is it actually going to be communicated to the employees in a meaningful way? Question 8, when we ask board members to explain the principles behind this policy, will they give a similar answer? Would it be the same if we ask middle managers? So, have you got consistency of interpretation, and who's supporting people to ensure consistency of communication and in turn interpretation of your policies? Question 9, is it clear that this policy is contractual? Is it clear what's contractual and what is not? So back to Martin's point earlier, ensuring that you're not contractualising things that you have no desire to at all. And question 10, do we have the capability to scan, understand and anticipate changes in the business and social landscape and exercise our judgment accordingly? So I think this is all about, again, making sure that your policies are live, dynamic and not out of date. So, to Elizabeth's warning, don't turn up in court and be asked to justify a policy which is decades old and has got a colleague's name against it who hasn't been in your business for 5 or so years.
Do you have any comments on that, Elizabeth? Sorry to spring that on you, but any further thoughts on what Karen's just said?
I think I think it's a really excellent list, Karen. And I do think it's interesting that we've talked about a lot through this session, thinking about that public element. And to go back to the question that was asked at the beginning, are we leading with the policy or is the policy, I think when you do your policy review, if you can identify what part of your purpose and values this policy supports or where you miss a policy, I think you'll get that right.
Thanks for that. And the audience didn't get much chance to talk to our 3 case studies. So if anybody's got any questions now, can you just raise your hand or just jump in? Martin.
And just an observation, I suppose, rather than a question. I mean, it's interesting that the approach that Mustafa and you've taken is clearly geared around, lower level working, if I can call it that, frontline working, particularly, based in a particular location. You've got no choice but to be there, where rules and regulations are really required for that consistency approach. And you don't want any difference between one plant or one shop and another. Whereas, Alistair, your approach, I think much more something that I could relate to, which is around professional services, much more flexibility. Give us a framework, we'll figure it out. We've got some nuance. We don't need to legislate for common sense. And I think the approach that policies take, the companies take, is based very much on what the employees are looking for on the employee base. The thing that I think that I'm reflecting on from this call, other than, whenever our HR lawyer talks about let's review the policy, that just doesn't get my juices flowing, frankly. Who wants to do that? But I do appreciate that, like clothing, can go out of fashion very quickly. They can be stale very quickly. They do need to be reviewed. Is that through this pandemic, I can't think of another time in my career, or maybe others can, when all of us as reward professionals have had to address and review policy gaps in areas that we've never had to think about before. Regional pay gaps all of a sudden, cross-border working in a way that we've never really thought about it. And I think it's quite interesting and almost exciting to be thinking about these challenges. Are we setting a number of days per annum you can work abroad? How are we going to manage and monitor that, maintain it, all the risks we take? It's really the birth of a new series of policies that I think we're having to face into, and all of a sudden the new practices will evolve, and there'll be competitive advantage and disadvantage between organizations where all of a sudden we say you can go and work, for example, 3 works in a rolling 12-month period in any country we're based in, and others won't have that policy. Well, that might work to our advantage until we find out the next company down the road is doing a 3-month opportunity instead of 3 weeks. Then we'll have to think about it again. So I think this is a rebirth of a whole range of policies, which I think we'll be discussing for quite a while.
I think that's a really exciting way of looking at it, and getting excited about policies. There's a bit of sadness in that, but I think your point about competitive advantage through policies is a really important one, and I think that that's something that the HR community could well think about. I started not to get excited, but I got a bit distressed, the conversation with Martin Warren earlier on, when we did talk about health and safety policies. Martin, what are the obligations of employers regarding health and safety for people working at home?
It's a well-timed question, Mike, because I meant to cover that in my observations, but the challenge is in reading my handwriting. Challenge for me as well. It's a big issue. It's a big issue. There was a really interesting report today put together by, I think it was City Pantry, that surveyed 180 UK employers, primarily office-based employers. And broadly, 81% of those think they'll only be back in the office in terms of workforce headcounts at 50% capacity or less. So what? I think the health and safety issues are huge, and I don't think they're fully absorbed as yet, because the health and safety legislation, 1974, the Act's been around, long time, drafted when the UK was either offices or factories. If you're going to have effectively some form of hybrid working, which Steve talked about, 60-40, whatever it's going to be, and or some form of remote working, I think an area to be thinking about long and hard is what controls as you are an employer going to put in to make sure your employees broadly work safely. And we're thinking about things like computer use, email use, all of the issues that in your work environment you probably have in your offices. You supply employees with the right kit, right chairs, you make sure they adopt the right postures. All that now is happening from home to a large extent. And if you look at what's being said by the health and safety exec, they're broadly saying the more permanent you envisage those arrangements to be, the more interventionist as an employer you need to be to ensure your employees' welfare. So I think it is one to think about, depending on, as Lizzie was saying, what is going to be your business model. So the more long-term your business model envisages people not being in the office, the greater your obligation to do what you can to keep them safe.
Thanks for that. And Elizabeth, you mentioned whistleblowing. Can you give us a sentence on whistleblowing?
Yeah, it's interesting how that has changed during the pandemic, because I think the lack of direct engagement between face-to-face between line managers and staff has meant that, and people being isolated has meant that they've got more concerned about these sorts of issues and are using more formal channels or even external channels to raise concerns. And a lot of organisations have adopted sort of speak up policies, which are meant to be about speaking up regularly in team meetings or in one-to-ones, rather than going through a whistleblowing channel. But I think we have to be mindful that as employees become more detached from the workplace, they may become more isolated in those concerns and use more formal channels to raise them. Yeah.
Phil, you've been very quiet during the course of today's proceedings. Comment, queries, challenges?
Sorry, I noted four things down. First of all, the shift between policies. I think Nicole raised this. I was interested. She talked about stopping, changing the language from stopping people taking advantage of the policies, and it strikes me that one of the first things I've noted is there's been a shift from kind of having policies for command and control. We have this policy to control you, as opposed to now moving in the direction of we have this policy to inspire you and to help you to be more productive. And really, it's a complete repositioning, if you like, of the policy manual. The second point I'd noticed was whether or not, and I was quite intrigued to hear from the practitioners, whether there has in fact been a change in approval rating for the company. We keep hearing that people won't forget the way this company has behaved during the pandemic and how it's treated its people. And I just wonder whether or not people have actually followed up on that in any way and seen whether there has been either a positive or negative change in approval rating for the company. Martin's point I can only re-emphasise about this is now potentially shifted policies to a source of strategic competitive advantage. And it's almost, I like the idea of the rebirth of the policy manual. And just to count forward what we're hoping to do in our next peer-to-peer exchange, quite a theme of this has been about the greater use of people working outside of the UK, and we're hoping to have a peer-to-peer exchange at our next meeting, next group meeting, on global mobility policy and how the attitudes of companies have shifted towards global mobility and the new ways of managing that versus the old ways that we're all so familiar with. Those were probably the 4 points I wanted to raise.
No, very, very good. So we're approaching the finish time, and Phil charged me at the end, at the start of this, with summarising. I think he's just done it pretty well, but a couple of words that I want to take away from today. I think this inspire thing, it's a good line. So policies are to control. No, they're not. They're to improve performance and inspire people and guide them in the right direction. I think that's a very positive endorsement. Whistleblowing worries me. Health and safety worries me. And I guess the whole question of who owns this, how are they formulated, and how are they communicated seems to me to be very important attributes of this discussion. The report's great, Steve, and I think we want to revisit that. Your 10 questions, I think, are stunningly good. And I'd like to thank our speakers. So certainly Elizabeth and Martin, I think, great job, both in terms of this afternoon and helping us put it together, and our 3 case studies this afternoon. All very informing and very interesting. Sadly, we don't have more time, but thanks to everybody for turning up, and thanks to everybody for your participation. Thanks a lot. See you next meeting. Bye.